Hey there, all you philosophy fans out there. Ready for another deep dive? This time we're tackling the one and only G.E. Moore.
Oh, yeah, Moore. One of the greats.
We're using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on him as our main guide, so we're going in deep. I bet a lot of you already know this, but Moore, Russell, and Wittgenstein, that was like the philosophical dream team at Cambridge.
Talk about an intellectual powerhouse.
They pretty much laid the foundation for what we now call analytic philosophy. But, what always struck me about Moore, besides his brilliant mind, of course, was his personality.
You mean how he just went against the grain? Both in his personal life and his philosophy.
Exactly. He wasn't afraid to shake things up.
You know, he absolutely hated his given names, George Edward. Everyone, even his wife, just called him Bill.
Huh. Yeah. Talk about a rebel. And that rebellious spirit, that's what I think shines through in his philosophy, too. He always questioned the status quo. Didn't matter if it was about knowledge, reality, or even morality.
Absolutely. Always challenging those fundamental assumptions.
So where do we even begin with a figure like Moore?
Well, let's start at the beginning, shall we? His early life and influences. Born South London.
And just a fun little side note here. His brother was the poet T. Sturge Moore, who actually worked with W.B. Yeats.
Small world, huh? But anyway, Moore ends up at Cambridge studying classics. But then, boom, he meets Russell and MacTaggart.
And that changes everything.
Yep, he switches to philosophy. It's like this whole new intellectual world opens up for him.
We're talking about a life-changing encounter.
And from there, things just take off. He wins a prestigious prize fellowship.
So now he could really immerse himself in philosophy.
Exactly. And his early work, you can see the influence of idealists like Bradley and MacTaggart.
Right, that whole idea that reality is ultimately mental.
But here's the fascinating part. He gradually starts to move away from idealism. In his 1898 dissertation, he's already critiquing Kant's a priori concepts and challenging Bradley's monism, this idea that reality is ultimately just this single, unified whole.
So he's starting to question that whole notion that the mind constructs reality.
You got it. He becomes a huge advocate for this clear separation between mind and objects, and that leads to some really groundbreaking work on meaning in The Nature of Judgment.
The Nature of Judgment. That's where he really lays the groundwork for his famous attack on idealism.
Oh, you mean the refutation of idealism?
That's the one, the refutation of idealism.
Yeah.
It's such a pivotal work. And that example he uses, the sensation of blue, it always gets me thinking.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic Moore move.
It's so simple, yet so profound. Can you break it down for us?
Okay, so picture this. You're looking at a beautiful, clear blue sky. Now, the idealists would say that the blueness you're seeing, it's just a mental content, a product of your mind.
Okay, I'm following so far.
But Moore comes in and says, hold on a second. He argues that blue is actually an object of experience, something distinct from your perception of it.
So it's not just in your head, it's actually out there in the world.
Exactly. And to make this point, he uses this idea of consciousness being diaphanous.
Diaphanous.
It's like saying consciousness is like a transparent window. It doesn't create the world, it just reveals it.
I like that analogy.
And then he goes even further, using Leibniz's law, the principle that if two things are identical, they have to share all the same properties.
Right, got it. But how does he apply that to idealism?
Well, he takes this concept that was central to idealist thought, the concept of internal relations.
Okay, remind me, what are internal relations again?
Idealists argue that relations between objects, things like being to the left of or being bluer than, those relations are actually internal to the objects themselves.
I'm starting to remember this now. So how does Moore use Leibniz's law to challenge that?
He says, look, if blue was really an internal property of experience, then all experiences would have to be blue.
Because they all share the property of being experiences.
But we know that's not true. We have all sorts of experiences that aren't blue. So he's saying that the quality of blueness, it exists independently of any particular experience.
Which totally contradicts that whole idealist notion that everything is ultimately contained within the mind.
Right. This argument really shook things up in the philosophical world and helped pave the way for a resurgence of realism.
It really showcases his analytical brilliance. I mean, taking this complex idea and just dissecting it, exposing its inconsistencies. But, we could spend hours on the refutation of idealism alone. Maybe we should move on to another pivotal work, Principia Ethica.
Principia Ethica, published in 1903, a landmark text in moral philosophy.
And I think it'll be especially interesting for our listeners, people who love to grapple with these big ethical questions.
For sure. Principia Ethica is where More introduces the naturalistic fallacy. It's one of his most influential contributions to ethical theory. He's basically saying it's a mistake to define goodness in purely natural terms.
Like saying good is the same thing as pleasure or happiness or some kind of evolutionary advantage.
Exactly. He's critiquing that whole approach. But he doesn't just stop there. He gives us a powerful argument for why it's wrong. That's where the open question argument comes in,
Oh
right?
yeah, the open question argument, that's a good one.
Moore points out that no matter what natural property you try to substitute for good, you can always still ask, but is it really good?
Wow.
That question, it always remains open.
So goodness is something unique. It can't be reduced to any other property.
Yeah.
It's like a fundamental concept in itself.
That's what he's arguing. Like, you could say, okay, pleasure often leads to good things, but is pleasure itself inherently good? You can't just answer that question by pointing to some natural fact. It goes deeper than that.
And that leads us to his concept of intrinsic value, right?
Yes, intrinsic value. Now, that's where things get really interesting.
And complex, I might add.
Definitely complex. But that's for next time.
All right, folks, we'll leave you hanging there for now. Be sure to join us for part 2, where we'll untangle the complexities of intrinsic value and delve deeper into More's profound impact on philosophy.
So, where were we? Ah, yes, intrinsic value, according to G.E. Moore.
Right, that tricky concept he introduces in Principia Ethica.
It's a bit of a head-scratcher, but stick with us. It's worth the effort.
Okay, so how did Moore distinguish intrinsic value from those other kinds of value? We talked about instrumental value, right?
Right, instrumental value. That's the value something has because it helps you get something else that's good, like a tool,
Oh, I see.
a hammer, let's say. It has instrumental value because it helps you build a house.
The hammer itself isn't good, but it's good for building something good.
That's the idea. But intrinsic value, that's different. It's good in and of itself, no strings attached. But then he throws in another kind of value, value as a part.
Value is a part. That one always tripped me up a little.
Yeah, it's a bit subtle. It means something has value because it contributes to a larger whole that's good. Think of, oh, I don't know, knowledge.
Knowledge, okay.
Knowledge might not be intrinsically good, like all by itself, but it can add value to other things, right? Like appreciating a work of art or understanding a scientific theory.
Ah, I see. So it's valuable as part of something bigger.
Exactly. But then Moore throws in another curveball, the principle of organic unities.
The principle of organic unities, why does he always have to make things so complicated?
Oh, that's philosophy for you, right? Always digging deeper.
True enough. So what is this principle all about?
It says that the value of a whole, well, it isn't just the sum of its parts.
So you can't just add up the value of each individual piece and get the total value.
Right. The whole can have this unique value that emerges from how the parts are arranged and how they interact.
Okay, now I'm really starting to see how this could get tricky, especially when you're thinking about ethics.
Oh, absolutely. Imagine trying to figure out if an action is morally right or wrong. The principle of organic unities says you can't just focus on the immediate consequences.
You have to consider the bigger picture, like how it fits into a whole web of relationships and intentions.
And long-term effects.
Yeah, it's not a simple calculation.
It's more like trying to solve a complex equation where the variables are constantly changing.
You can't just plug in numbers and expect a neat answer.
Nope. Moral life is messy.
Speaking of messy, let's talk about Moore's views on philosophical analysis. Even though he wasn't a fan of those big philosophical systems, like logical atomism or logical empiricism, he was still a huge advocate for careful analysis,
He was all about breaking down those complex concepts.
like getting to the core of what we're really talking about.
Right. And his work on propositions, that's a great example. Remember how he initially thought propositions were these independent, eternal entities? Almost like facts themselves.
Yeah, I vaguely remember that. It is a bit hard to wrap my head around. Didn't he end up revising that view, though?
He did. As he delved deeper into the whole concept of falsehood, he realized that, well, it didn't really make sense for false propositions to exist in the same way that true facts do.
So what did he think propositions were then?
He started to see them more as tools we use to think and talk about truth and falsehood, not so much as things in themselves, but as ways of representing those things.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense.
Mm-hmm.
Like, language is important for doing philosophy, but we have to be careful not to get tripped up by it.
Exactly. And you can see Russell's influence here, too.
Wow.
Moore starts to warm up to the idea of logical fictions, those useful concepts that don't necessarily correspond to actual things out there in the world.
Like he was willing to admit that some of those big philosophical categories we use might be more about how we think than about how the world really is.
That's it. And then there were those famous debates with Russell about implication and existence, two pretty fundamental
Oh,
concepts.
yeah, those were some intense philosophical sparring matches.
Mm.
What was Moore's take on those issues?
Well, he challenged Russell's view that if-then statements in logic completely captured the meaning of implication. He thought there was a stronger kind of logical connection, what he called entailment.
So, not just that one thing follows from another, but that it has to follow.
Exactly, it's a more necessary connection. And then there was the whole debate about existence. Russell, as you know, was adamant that existence wasn't a regular predicate. It's more like something expressed by that there exists symbol in logic.
Right. You can't just say tame tigers exist in the same way you say tame tigers growl. It's more like there's at least one thing that is a tame tiger.
That's the idea. But Moore pushed back a bit, arguing that sentences like, this might not exist, make perfect sense. So existence must be a meaningful concept at some level.
He was basically questioning whether formal logic really captured all the nuances of how we talk about existence in everyday language.
Exactly. He was always pushing the boundaries, even when it came to challenging his friend and mentor.
And that's what I find so admirable about him. He never shied away from a good philosophical debate. It's that same spirit of inquiry that drives his work on perception, right? That's where he introduces the whole idea of sense data.
Right, sense data. It's another area where he's grappling with the implications of his realism. Remember, in The Refutation of Idealism, he's arguing that we directly experience objects like the color blue.
Yeah, but then he runs into a problem. How to explain situations where our perceptions don't match up with reality, like illusions or hallucinations?
That's the challenge. How do you square direct realism with those cases where things appear differently than they actually are?
It's a real head scratcher.
And to tackle this problem, he brings in sense data. He's saying that those are the immediate objects of perception. So when you see a white envelope, what you're directly experiencing is a sense datum of a certain whitish color, shape, and size.
So the sense datum, it's like the raw data of experience, and it's not always a reliable guide to the real properties of the object.
You got it. So Moore can say that sometimes the properties of sense data match up with the properties of objects in the world, and sometimes they don't.
Okay, that makes sense. But then the big question becomes, what's the relationship between sense data and physical objects? I mean, if they're not always the same thing, how are they connected?
Ah, that's the million-dollar question. And that's where Moore takes us on a whirlwind tour of different theories of perception. He really dives in deep, exploring all the different options and trying to sort them out.
So he's considering indirect realism, phenomenalism, and direct realism.
Those are the main contenders. Each one has its pros and cons. And Moore, being Moore, he carefully analyzes every single one of them. He's looking for any philosophical cracks, any inconsistencies.
So let's take them one by one. Indirect realism, that's the idea that we don't actually perceive physical objects directly, right? We only experience them indirectly through sense data.
That's the gist of it. But as you might imagine, it kind of leads you down a slippery slope towards skepticism.
Because if all we ever know are sense data, how can we be sure there's a real world out there causing those sense data?
Exactly. That gap between our experiences and reality, well, it starts to look like an unbridgeable chasm. It's a recipe for doubt.
So what about phenomenalism that tries to avoid the skepticism problem, right? By saying that physical objects are just constructions out of sense data.
That's the strategy. But it comes with its own set of baggage.
Because then it seems like the world just becomes this collection of perceptions. It's all in our heads, kind of like that Pickwickian world Moore talked about.
It does raise some red flags, doesn't it? It makes reality overly dependent on our minds. Plus, phenomenalism has trouble explaining how we can even spot patterns in our sense data and predict future experiences without assuming there's a mind-independent world out there. It gets a little circular.
Okay, so that leaves us with direct realism. That's the view where sense data are actually parts of physical objects, right?
That's the idea. It's tempting because it's the most straightforward option. But there's a catch, a big one.
Yeah, the problem of hallucinations. If sense data are just bits of physical objects, what's going on when we see things that aren't really there?
That's the snag. Direct realism has a tough time accounting for those phantom perceptions.
I remember reading about some other theories that tried to solve this problem, like Ducasse' adverbial theory. It tried to explain perception as modifications of our experience, not as relations to objects in the world. Did Moore ever consider those alternative theories?
He did. Later in his career, he came across Ducasse's theory and was intrigued. It seemed like a promising way to deal with hallucinations, but he still wasn't entirely convinced.
That's classic Moore, always keeping an open mind, even when it meant questioning his own views. It really shows his commitment to getting things right, no matter where the philosophical journey led him. And speaking of journeys, this brings us to Moore's famous defense of common sense. In his paper, A Defense of Common Sense.
Where he basically lays down the law, philosophically speaking.
He gives us this list of truisms, those everyday beliefs we take for granted, like, the earth has existed for many years before my body was born, or I have two hands. And he argues that we can be absolutely certain about these truisms.
It's a pretty bold statement, but it goes to the core of his whole philosophical approach. He's saying that these common sense beliefs, they're the foundation for everything else we know and believe.
They're like the non-negotiables of knowledge.
And any philosophical theory that contradicts those truisms, well, it's got to be wrong, or at least deeply flawed.
But didn't that approach sometimes clash with his emphasis on philosophical analysis? Analysis is all about questioning our assumptions, even those really basic ones.
It does seem like there's a bit of tension there, but I think Moore saw common sense and analysis as complementary. He thought analysis could help us understand common sense more clearly and defend it more rigorously.
So analysis wasn't about overturning common sense, but about refining it.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. He saw analysis as a tool for making those fundamental truths more explicit and more defensible. And you see this in his famous Proof of an External World, where he just holds up his hands and says, here's one hand, here's another, therefore an external world exists.
It's such a simple argument, it's almost disarming. But I think a lot of people miss the point. He wasn't trying to give some elaborate refutation of skepticism. What was he aiming for?
He was trying to cut through all the philosophical jargon and appeal to our most basic, everyday experience, to show in the simplest way possible that things exist outside of our minds.
It's a powerful reminder that philosophy, even when it gets abstract, should never lose touch with the world we live in. But even more, with his strong commitment to common sense, he had his moments of doubt, especially when wrestling with the whole problem of skepticism. In those later essays, like Four Forms of Skepticism and Certainty, he admits that he can't be absolutely certain he's not dreaming.
It's a pretty humbling admission. It shows his intellectual honesty, his willingness to follow the argument wherever it leads. But what's fascinating is how those struggles with skepticism actually influenced later philosophers, especially Wittgenstein.
His uncertainty is all about grappling with those same questions about common sense and the foundations of knowledge.
Right. It's like Moore's legacy lives on, not just in his own arguments, but in the ongoing conversations he inspired. And of course, there's Moore's paradox. That weird puzzle where saying, it's raining but I don't believe it, is inherently contradictory.
It's one of those things that seems so obvious, but then you start thinking about it and your brain just melts a little.
Right. It's deceptively simple, but it gets at something really deep about the nature of belief and self-knowledge. Moore himself had an explanation for it, based on the idea that we usually believe what we say. But Wittgenstein saw something even more profound going on, something about our identity as thinkers.
It's like the very act of saying that sentence undermines our own authority as a knower. It creates this cognitive dissonance that's hard to shake.
It really does, and I think this example highlights what makes Moore such an enduring figure in philosophy. He wasn't trying to build some grand system like Kant or Hegel. He was more of a philosophical problem solver, pointing out those curious features of language, belief, and experience, forcing us to re-examine what we thought we knew.
He had a knack for finding those pressure points in our thinking, those places where our intuitions collide and our concepts start to break down. And his work, even when it doesn't give us definitive answers, pushes us to confront those big questions about knowledge, reality, and value.
He wasn't afraid to ask the hard questions, and that's what makes him so relevant even today. He reminds us that philosophy isn't just about abstract theories, it's about looking closely at the world and how we make sense of it.
Well said. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the fascinating world of G.E. Moore, I'm left wondering, if you had to pick just one of Moore's ideas to keep exploring, which one would it be, and why does it resonate with you?
That's a tough one. There are so many great ideas to choose from. But I think I'd keep digging into his concept of intrinsic value. It's a concept with so many implications, not just for ethics, but for aesthetics and our understanding of good life. What about you? Which Morean thread would you keep pulling on?
I'm drawn to his defense of common sense. It feels especially relevant in our current age of misinformation and alternative facts. Understanding the role of common sense in grounding our beliefs and navigating a complex world, well, I think that's more important than ever. So, to our listeners, we leave you with that thought. Moore's legacy is a rich one, full of insights and challenges. We encourage you to explore his work and see where your own philosophical journey takes you.